Okay, so for today, we hopefully you had a chance to do a bit of networking. You met with some folks, introduced yourself. It's okay if you didn't as well. I'm Carlos, so I'm a Design Sprint facilitator. I work with AdaptiveX, and we work with companies to run Design Sprint workshops. I have really great colleagues of mine who are a bit silent at the moment and maybe off audio, but they're going to be helping quite a bit. We're going to do a quick presentation on visualizing the opportunity. I'm going to walk you through a couple of different maps just to kind of give you guys an idea of what are some of the differences. We use a lot of maps in our work, and we do use them in design sprints as well. So given that this is the design sprint community and a design sprint meetup, we thought what better to have a topic just on mapping. If you guys happen to be on the meetup previous, and we did record that meetup, so if you're interested in watching even the first 5 minutes of that video or of that meetup, you'll have an opportunity to learn more about what is a design sprint because it includes a bit of a crash course on it. So day one is all about mapping and visualizing the problem and visualizing the challenge. And so we're going to be talking about mapping in this presentation. Now there's the default map that comes with the design sprint. So if you just read the book, for example, if you pick up the sprint book by John Zeratsky and Jake Knapp, then you have kind of the default mapping activity that comes with that. But at any point in time, you can actually pick up a different one, for example, and kind of plug and play. So for example, if you just go and do a Google search and you look up different types of maps, even under Google, for their design sprint recipes, you can see that they've got user journey mapping, they've got experience mapping, so they even give you different recipes for mapping that you can kind of plug into your sprint. So Google, they've got dozens and dozens of different methods that you can plug into a sprint. If you go and look at IDEO, they've also got hundreds of different design thinking activities that you can kind of leverage or be inspired about and plug into a sprint. And so today we're going to be talking about, well, what type of map would you use, and what's the difference between some of the maps, and also what's the difference between those maps and, let's say, the default design sprint map that comes with the sprint process. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. One thing to consider is why does this even matter? So why do we want to visualize the problem, or why do we want to do mapping? So there's a couple of key things. One is, if you're working inside of an organization, you'll notice that you probably have silos within the organization. So you've got information silos, departments that may not necessarily be talking to each other. They're hoarding information, or maybe not even purposefully, but you might have information that's just not flowing properly. So it's not flowing from leadership or from management, let's say, to employees, or from marketing to sales, for example. And that can cause all kinds of different problems. So you can have, duplication of effort, you can have some missed opportunities. The bigger kind of issues that you've got, maybe a general lack of alignment around your customer journey and the overall customer experience. So you might have marketing kind of pushing for acquisition of new customers and really promoting and getting advertising, but you might have some retention issues, for example. So for every dollar that you're spending bringing a new customer into your organization or into your product or service, if 1 out of 2 customers are leaving and you're not retaining them, you're actually wasting quite a bit of money. So if you've got this kind of lack of alignment across the customer's journey within your organization, you're missing a big opportunity in terms of both customer value but also business value. And then not only that, you've also got, especially with everything that's happening now, you've got this kind of increased uncertainty. So you've got customers that are changing their habits quite quickly, they're changing their behaviors quite quickly. It's really starting to disrupt a lot of how we're doing business. And so as a business, we have to look for new opportunities within that journey to see how we can actually service and offer our customers. So these are common challenges. Now, the data tells us that organizations that get this right, so if you look at optimizing your customer journey, if you look at really understanding your customer journey, you perform better in terms of revenue, customer satisfaction, lower cost to serve your customers versus your competitors. McKinsey's latest report from 2019, I believe, or 2018, kind of puts these into numbers. So companies that do get this right outperform their competitors, and by how much. So you can actually quantify some of this in terms of dollars and business value. So you want to focus on the customer. You want to understand kind of the journey that the customer is going through, align everybody within your organization. Now, visualization is key, and it's key because our brain processes information visually 60,000 times faster. We get a lot more data, a lot more information when we're looking at something visually than just by using words or just by using verbal. So visualization really does help in terms of trying to reduce that complexity in our work, in the experience, in the problem. So it's a technique that we use quite a bit in design thinking. It's a technique that we use heavily inside of design sprints. So those things kind of are helpful in terms of the research and the data. And so for us, the way forward is we use mapping. Now, we want to create mapping so that we understand the needs of our customers, so that we understand the opportunities that we can actually go after as a business in order to kind of help address those needs, including the steps that we have to take to make that happen. The reason why we would also use it is for building that kind of shared understanding. So if you're in a sprint, you've got limited time, you really want to get the team aligned quite quickly. So a map can help them build alignment and get that shared understanding around what they need to tackle and what they need to solve. Really capture customer data in a meaningful way. So if you've already done some research and you want to bring that research into the sprint, that can be really helpful to kind of visualize and then allow the team again to kind of get up to speed in terms of understanding the customer and understanding, or the user, let's say, and understanding the problem. And then ultimately to make better decisions. So if we're looking at where are we going to apply our effort, where are we going to solve a particular problem, maybe there's multiple problems, where can we actually target it to create something meaningful that will really change the experience for our customer? Ultimately, the map can really help with that. So there's 3 maps that we're going to look at briefly. One is the empathy map. So for some of you that are, let's say, UX researchers, for example, this might be old hat. Actually, some of these maps might be old hat for you. So this presentation is not necessarily at the advanced, let's say, research level, because you might be dealing with much more kind of sophisticated maps. But from our perspective, this is very helpful regardless, and for a couple of reasons. One is it's helpful to get a better understanding of who is your user and who is your customer. So what this does is it allows us to kind of put ourselves in their shoes. So in 2 ways. One, perhaps we have data. So we've done some customer interviews. We've actually done some problem validation where we've gone out, we've talked to customers, we've done some field studies, for example, and now we want to catalog the information that we've captured. So, when the customer is experiencing our service or our product, what are they saying about it? What are they thinking? How are they feeling? Like, are they anxious or confused? What are they doing? So it's really just trying to understand from there, how do they actually experience our product or our service? And it gives us more information into who they are as a type of user as well. And so that can be very powerful and very helpful as kind of a first step in the design process. And so, there's the 2 ways of using the empathy map. So the one way is you've actually gone out and done some research. So you've done some interviews, for example, and now you're cataloging that information and building that shared alignment and understanding with your team. Or the other way is to really just use some assumptions and kind of build it quite quickly with your team to help build empathy and get everybody aligned on who the end user is that we're going to be trying to help or trying to solve for. So even if you're just using some assumptions, for example, it can kind of help to maybe test some hypotheses or get at least some alignment around that. So the empathy map is a really good tool to start at the beginning. Now, a lot of times you might even do this before the design sprint. So if you're looking at a couple of different customers or different users, then building an empathy map can be actually quite helpful, especially if you've done some user research up front. The next piece is the journey map. So the journey map is now kind of taking your customers or your users and aligning them against a timeline in terms of what is the process that they're going through to achieve a goal, right? So, and this is chronological. It's based on a timeline, for example. It's looking at all the steps. So it's a little bit different than the empathy map. The empathy map, we want to really understand and build empathy for our customer. And it's not necessarily chronological. It's not necessarily looking at a timeline of steps or events, for example. It is kind of peering into what are they thinking, what are they feeling, whereas the journey map is now looking at the process on how they interact with our product or our service across a timeline or across a number of steps. And a couple things that are unique to the journey map. So one, you still have to have a target user or target customer. So you know who your customer is, you know who your user is, and you might have used an empathy map to kind of build out, let's say, a persona, for example, or to get more clear about who that user is. And you also understand what the goal is. So what are they actually trying to do? So, in our case, maybe they're switching mobile plans. So they're up for maybe renewal of their contract, and they're kind of interested in thinking about switching a plan, for example. So this is a user who's very specific, is interacting with our business. Maybe we're a telecom company, and they have a very specific goal in mind, and they're going to go through a set of steps that are going to be chronological, time sequenced, and they're going to have very specific themes. So how do they define what they're looking for, maybe do some comparisons, negotiate, and then select the plan. Now, you'll see that life cycle across the user's journey is really important. And within that life cycle, there's a series of actions that they're taking or situations that they're going through. And then beyond that, we're back down to now that empathy again. So what are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are high points? So what are their emotions, their mindsets? And this really helps us to kind of uncover what are the opportunities that we can actually work on in order to improve, to create something more meaningful here in their experience. So a journey map can be quite powerful. And in fact, actually, the design sprint map is more comparable to the journey map. And we'll take a look at that here in a second. So the last one is the experience map. So an experience map is kind of like what you would actually do before the journey map. So sometimes for organizations, it's really important to understand holistically what's the whole experience. So perhaps, the journey map is looking at a very specific user within a very specific journey of how they're interacting with your product or service. So if you're Uber or if you're Lyft, it's how they're calling for an Uber or Lyft, perhaps when they're on their way to the airport to go for, let's say, a vacation, for example. In the experience map, you're looking at the whole experience holistically. So perhaps we're actually looking at, from the minute that the user thinks about getting, or let's say, books the flight to the minute that they actually show up at the all-inclusive resort. And there's a number of different experiences that are, or journeys that are going through, not just the Uber, but also let's say the flight itself, and then the airport taxi. So you're looking at a holistic experience of, let's say, a generic user. And that gives you a lot of value as an organization, because now you can actually kind of identify, okay, what are the journeys that we're specifically going to focus on that's relevant to us? And also, what are some synergies that we can actually create across journeys as well? So for example, we might look at the house purchasing process, even though for our company or our product, we're only interested in the inspection, because the inspection is where our product kicks in. But looking at the end user's experience across the whole home purchase process can be extremely valuable. So you might do an experience map up front. And in a design sprint, sometimes you'll hear this kind of aspect of problem framing. So before going into the sprint, we might do some problem framing. An experience map can be actually quite helpful in that problem framing. So if you're dealing with like a multi-year project that's very complex, very complicated, you might do an experience map up front to kind of get a better understanding of the experience for the customer. And then afterwards decide on, okay, what is the target user and what is the target journey that we're going to focus on for this specific sprint. So that's something that we've done in the past and that we've seen. So the experience map is kind of like the grandparent, and then the journey map is like the child, for example. So you would do an experience map before the journey map. And then ultimately, like regardless if it's an empathy map, a journey map, or an experience map, the other thing that you want to consider, so when you're mapping, basically there's three key decisions that you're making. And so one is, okay, are we looking at the current situation, right? So this is an as-is situation, how customers are experiencing our journey with our product right now. Or are we looking at a future situation? So the current situation is obviously very helpful when you want to understand what are the pains and gains that they're going through at the moment so that we can actually work to solve them. A future map, you might be benchmarking for an ideal state. You can say, okay, look, we're going to be building a product, and this product has to have this type of experience. So sometimes in the Agile community, we'll work on story maps, like user story maps. And those story maps might be actually more kind of future oriented, because we're working through the implementation details. And we're saying, okay, our product doesn't exist yet, but we're going to be building our product. And this is kind of what the experience is going to look like in the future. So customer journey maps, a lot of the times when we're working with them, especially in design sprints, we're looking at current as is. We want to build alignment around what's the experience today, what are the problems that exist, and how do we solve those problems. But there are many times where you can do a future map as well. And then the other kind of dimension is hypothesis-based versus research-based. So hypothesis-based is simply assumptions. So similar to what I was saying before around the empathy map, for example, where we want to build more knowledge around a specific user or customer, and we're just going to make some assumptions. We're going to get our team in a room, and we're going to kind of, what are the biggest pain points for this customer? What do we know or we think we know? And let's put that down on the map for now. But maybe it's not research-based. So maybe we haven't actually gone out and done the interviews, or we haven't gone out and done kind of the field work that we need to do, or the research in order to actually build the map. So your map could be just hypothesis-based with assumptions, or it could be research-based. Hypothesis-based can be quite valuable, especially if it's helping you to then do your research that you need to do, so that you can actually validate some of those assumptions that you've put on. And then finally, you've got like low fidelity versus high fidelity. So low fidelity is like, is this something that's just, quick? We got to get it up and running just to kind of help build that alignment, help communicate, have those conversations. But we are still going to do some validation. So we're not worried about it being, pixel perfect, or because we're not sharing it out with the rest of the organization at this point, maybe, or we're not sharing it out with clients, for example, broader than just the team. So low fidelity versus high fidelity is another decision that you'd be making as well. For the design sprint, typically what I see when we're running sprints, the most common, and it's not to say that we haven't done sprints that are other than this, but usually the most common is current as is. So let's get an understanding of what the experience is like today for a customer. Let's get the understanding of what they're doing today as they're interacting with our product, for example. And then what are the opportunities that we can work on? So the pains and gains, for example. Where are we going to target it, and how are we going to help to kind of improve and deliver more value, not only for them, but also for the business. They are a bit more hypothesis-based. So in some cases, you will have research coming in. So maybe there's somebody who's done user research. They have a really good understanding, and now you're interviewing them as a subject matter expert, for example, or you've done some problem framing, let's say before the sprint. So you can have data that's more research-based that's coming in. But a lot of times what you're doing is you're aligning that core team to understanding who the user is and what the experience is, and there's a lot of assumptions. Now, the reason why it's okay in a sprint is because, in fact, we're going to be testing it quite quickly. So although it's called a design sprint, it's empirical in nature, meaning that we're actually going to test and get data at the end of it. So it's okay that it's hypothesis-based right now, because by the end of it, we're going to understand if this is actually, do they like this or do they not? Was this a real problem or was it not? So it's going to get tested quite quickly. And then finally, that's also why it's low fidelity. So we just want enough understanding where everybody's aligned. We've kind of highlighted the core problem. It's setting us up so that we understand what we need to do when we go into kind of ideation and solutioning. And so that's also, again, why it's low fidelity. So after a sprint, or even let's say after 2 sprints, at that point, you've iterated on your map, you've got better data, and you can start kind of building something out that's more high fidelity, especially if you want to share it out with the rest of the organization. The challenge with the map, in terms of facilitating it in a design sprint, is that sometimes it can lead to circular discussions and kind of endless conversations, which are helpful, obviously, for alignment, but can be unhelpful, especially if with the sprint we're going for speed, because the reality is we want to get that real data at the end of the sprint as quickly as possible, so that we understand whether we're on the right track or not. So while a lot of the different activities in a sprint are facilitated using techniques that get you through it quite quickly, sometimes facilitators, especially new facilitators, can get tripped up a little bit on areas including like the map, for example, as well as things like the storyboard. So anytime where you have these open dialogues or open conversations where you have lots of input, lots of perspectives, potentially, people with, different levels of interest or dominating personalities, that can easily kind of throw you off as a facilitator. So a lot of times we're looking for, okay, are there techniques, are there hacks that we can use in facilitation to help us get through this still with good quality, but faster, because we got to keep moving forward. So that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at here in a second, is called the map and note method. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the different maps. We talked about empathy maps. Sometimes you can actually just use the empathy map in a design sprint as well. So actually, when we get into AI and start talking about machine learning, for example, if you were working on something for Alexa, or if you were working on programming something for Google Voice or Google Assistant, understanding that there's different personas, different people that are interacting with your product. So how a teenager would interact, or how a child would interact with Alexa, is very different than maybe perhaps how an adult would interact. And even adults, depending on that persona, how they interact can be quite different. So building some empathy and creating some proto-personas can be actually quite helpful, especially if your prototype is things like improv, where you're, because you're doing voice action, you're actually just coming up with scenarios, for example, and then acting them out, and that that becomes a bit of your role playing and your prototype. So an empathy map can be quite powerful in that type of design sprint. Definitely the journey map, where you have a target user, you've got a specific journey, it's 5 to 10 steps, and you're trying to figure out where's the biggest pain and gain today. That's the most common one used in a design sprint. And then an experience map is something that you could use before the sprint, especially if you've got something that's super complex, or you want to look at the experience holistically to make sure that you're choosing the journey map that's most appropriate as you start to work through your design sprint. So that can be quite helpful. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the map and note method. So like I was saying before, the problem with facilitating some of these mapping sessions is that if you're having these open dialogues, it can take a very long time because you're trying to align people, so you're getting different perspectives. Ultimately, you just want to have that conversation. You want to build that shared understanding. You want something that you can easily communicate and continue to refer back to it over the course of the next few days as you're running your sprint. But ultimately, really where you're unlocking the power of a map is when you've kind of uncovered what are those opportunities that we can focus, that we can target to really create a meaningful experience for this person. And so that's what you want to get to. So this technique here was created by Stéphane Cruchon. He does a lot of really great work in the global community. He created a really great article called the Design Sprint Note and Map. So we'll provide the link and the resource to it as well. But the way that it works is it leverages some of the facilitation principles in a sprint. So it uses what we call the note and vote. So the note and vote is, it uses like silent writing. So the whole point is that you give some people some time to think before you just jump into group dialogue and group conversations. So, you give everybody a few minutes, get them to think on their own, come up with their own ideas, and then afterwards start to kind of merge it in with the rest of the group using a facilitated technique. So to be effective, what you need to do when you're running this technique is you want to make sure that you still have agreed on your target user or your target actor. So who is the customer or who is the user that you're going to be focusing on? You want to make sure you have a beginning of the journey, right? And you have an end to the journey. So you need the bookends of your journey. Now, you can still run a couple of quick activities to make that happen, right? So you can just simply get everybody to kind of note down some users, get them to vote on which user they think is the most appropriate in terms of that you want to focus the sprint on. You might have already done this before the sprint, for example. And then afterwards, you want to, again, same thing. Okay, where does this journey begin? Where does it end? So you can do a quick note and vote on that. So get people to kind of write things down, vote on it. And now you've got your user, you've got your beginning, and you've got your end of the journey, which are the critical pieces that you want before kind of going into mapping. And again, you can do that fairly quickly with not a lot of discussion, for example. And now when you're actually mapping out the activity, what you do is you first get everybody to just take some Post-it notes and actually fill in all the steps. So when they're looking at the journey, what are the 5 to 10 steps that go from the beginning to the end? And then afterwards, what's going to happen is everybody gets a chance to put up their journey. They just simply read it out. And then, you don't spend a lot of dialogue here, but if there's some clarification points, you can kind of do that. But the whole point is just to simply get your version of the journey out. And then people will get a chance to kind of vote on what steps they feel are most interesting and most relevant to what we're trying to achieve. And so you just do that simply by putting some, dots on the steps that you think are most relevant, not just on your journey, but on others. So you look at all the different journeys that people have created, and then you actually just kind of vote on the steps that you think are most relevant that you want to include in your map. And then after that's done, the facilitator will actually remove any steps that don't have a lot of votes, right? So maybe people just didn't find this particular step that interesting, so they remove that. And with the steps that are remaining, you create the final map. So the facilitator will create the final map based on the steps that are remaining. And so this technique is something that you can run, you can practice, and you can get through it pretty quickly. What I mean by pretty quickly is that you can get through it, within an hour. Now for us, we're gonna have a lot less time. You guys are gonna have like half an hour max, 20 minutes probably to do that. But the whole point is that, again, because really what we're trying to do is we're just trying to align the team on, okay, what's a general process showing the user going from the beginning of the journey to their goal. And once we agree on that, let's take some insights that we've learned, apply that to the map, and then identify the opportunities where we want to improve. So that's the process. So a reminder, after you've completed filling in your row, you're going to click on Sessions and go into your table to talk to your team. This technique that we used here is when everybody was coming up with their own steps silently. So it's a powerful technique. It allows people to contribute their individual opinions, their individual ideas, their voices without necessarily being kind of caught in the groupthink. So it's a technique that you should use more often at work and that we don't use enough at work actually. Even when you go into your table sessions, you're not necessarily going to get into a lot of dialogue. The first thing you're going to do is you're actually going to vote on the steps that you think are most relevant and most interesting. And then the facilitator will actually start to peel away the ones that are not going to be used to create one story, one journey. Welcome back. So thanks everyone for attending our Design Sprint Network meetup on mapping and visualizing the opportunity. For those of you that participated and were able to try out the map and note method, really hope you enjoyed it and you found it effective. Ultimately, just to summarize, maps are really important for us to be able to kind of visualize what the challenge is, where we are, where we want to go. Ultimately, having that kind of conversation with our team to align on that, build that shared understanding. That's really what it is really kind of helping to facilitate that conversation. And then in the end, really help us to understand, okay, where's the biggest opportunity that we want to focus our attention on so that we can actually solve something for this customer, make something meaningful, but then also capture some business value. So that's what maps really help us to achieve. And hopefully you had a chance to see some of the different maps in tonight's meetup. And for those of you that weren't able to join the meetup but are watching the video, hopefully you found some value there. Stay connected with us. Follow us on LinkedIn. So join the Design Sprint Network LinkedIn group where we'll post up this video and other resources. And sign up for the Design Sprint Network on meetup.com. And the next meetup is going to be on AI and machine learning applied with design sprints. So we're pretty excited about that, and hopefully we'll see you there. Thanks.